A flight attendant was quietly harassing passengers while parents slept, but when the father's trained K-9 sprang into action, the entire cabin froze in shock. He quietly strangled kids while parents dozed, believing no one could stop him mid-flight. He didn't notice the K-9 above, eyes blazing, waiting for the exact moment to strike subscribe if you believe protection always finds its target, no matter how silent the threat. Captain Rylan Voss's gaze narrowed as he spotted the faintest motion near the third row of bassinets. It was nothing at first, a subtle shift, a shadow that moved just slightly against the glow of the cabin's nightlights, but it was enough to make him pause. He adjusted his headset with a slow, deliberate motion, his right hand still hovering above the throttle control, and turned his eyes from the instrument panel to the overhead camera feed of the cabin. Everything looked normal. Rows of passengers asleep under soft blankets, occasional flickers from seatback screens, and dim overhead lights casting a blue hue across the interior of Ariane Air Flight 914. But something gnawed at him. In the aisle, Merrick Halden moved quietly, almost too quietly for someone whose job it was to assist passengers. His footsteps made no sound, his hands always folded at his waist, then flicking out to adjust a blanket or tuck in a shoulder. Most would have admired his attention to detail, but beneath his measured movements was a disturbing fluidity, more like a predator pacing a hunting ground than a servant ensuring comfort. Rylan keyed the intercom, not to speak, but just to listen. The channel picked up ambient cabin noise, hushed breathing, a faint mechanical whir, a child's muffled sigh, then silence again. He leaned back, eyes darting toward the cabin feed, focusing on the forward section where the bassinets had been placed. There was Merrick, pausing, his gaze resting a little too long on a crib to his left. His hand reached out, not to fix a blanket, but to brush the edge of it. Just a test, just a whisper of intent, the kind that wouldn't trip any alarm. But it was wrong. It felt wrong. In the cockpit's half-light, Rylan's fingers curled around the yoke without applying pressure. His left knee bounced once. Instinct overrode logic. He'd flown this route dozens of times, and he knew how uneventful these red-eye flights usually were, and yet, tonight, every nerve in his body vibrated with tension. Flight 914, altitude stable, all systems nominal, he muttered, mostly to himself, as his co-pilot slept in the adjacent seat, head turned away. The gentle droning of the engines should have been soothing, but instead it pressed in around him like a fog. Thick, smothering, and laced with dread, he sat up straighter. On the screen, Merrick moved to the next row. A man, presumably the boy's father, slept with his arm draped protectively over the small crib built into the extended footrest. The baby inside stirred slightly. Merrick didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned in closer. His expression remained calm, even gentle, but Rylan noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingertips twitched as if rehearsing something. A chill ran down the captain's spine. He toggled the cabin light brightness, dimming it further to test the reaction, to shift the play of shadows, to see if Merrick would adjust. He did. Instantly, as if he had been waiting for that very change. Rylan watched Merrick's eyes flick upward for half a second, then drop back to the crib. No flight attendant responds that fast to ambient lighting, Rylan whispered under his breath. He reached for the crew-wide comm button but stopped himself. Was he being paranoid? His reports had to be grounded in observable facts. He couldn't sound an alert on instinct alone. But instinct had saved lives before back in the cabin, Merrick reached into the side pocket of his uniform jacket. Not fast, not suspicious, just fluid. His hand came out empty, but it had paused too long. His fingers flexed once, then settled on the edge of the bassinet's panel, where he ran his nail along the groove as if inspecting it. The child inside stirred again. Merrick's lips curled slightly, but not into a smile, more like a reflex of satisfaction. He moved on. Rylan tapped into the cockpit's auxiliary camera angles. Each showed more of the same. Dim blue lights, slumbering passengers, a peaceful cabin, until you paid attention to the one moving among them like a ghost with a script. Merrick's pattern was not random. He was working the rows in an odd rhythm, skipping one, returning, skipping two. Testing, measuring, rehearsing something beneath the performance. Rylan sat forward, his voice low and deliberate now. Control, this is Flight 914 requesting a routine crew security cross-check. No immediate assistance required, but please log timestamp 0304 and monitor. He released the button before anyone could ask questions, just in case. He didn't want to escalate yet, but he wanted someone, somewhere to know that at this precise minute, something had changed in the air. In the camera, Merrick's posture shifted ever so slightly, as if he could feel that someone was watching. Rylan reached to adjust the flight controls again, fingers steady but breath caught halfway between a sigh and a brace. He didn't know what Merrick was planning, but it wasn't routine, it wasn't professional, and if the tension twisting in his gut was any indication, it wasn't harmless either. Then Merrick paused mid-aisle. A new crib, a new child, another father asleep nearby, head lolled against the window, completely unaware of the hands that hovered near his son. Rylan leaned closer to the monitor. Merrick bent slightly. His hand hovered an inch above the baby's chest. Just hovering, but long enough to send Rylan's pulse through the roof. He reached for the cabin alert button but stopped again. Merrick withdrew, smoothed the blanket, adjusted the latch of the bassinet with a professional flick, then turned slowly to continue. But he wasn't serving. He was selecting. And Rylan knew it. His voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible even to himself. "Something feels off tonight," he muttered quietly, adjusting the controls, unaware that within minutes the flight would descend into chaos. The child whimpered. It was soft, too soft to register over the steady hum of the engines or the occasional creak of the overhead compartments, but enough to stir the silence like a ripple on still water. Merrick Halden's eyes flicked sideways as he paused in the center of the cabin, his gaze scanning the rows of cribs nestled beside their dozing fathers. His footsteps had grown slower, more calculated. His gloves, once folded discreetly in his back pocket, were now pulled tight across his fingers. There was no hesitation in his movements, only the eerie calm of someone who had rehearsed each step in solitude 100 times before. Beside seat 9A, a boy named Joran shifted in his crib. He was no more than 2 years old, cheeks flushed with warmth, a small pacifier bobbing with each breath. His father, slumped in light sleep beside him, didn't stir as Merrick leaned in with robotic grace. With both hands, the attendant reached into the crib. Not a grab, a cradle. Gentle at first, then pressure. Joran's eyes snapped open. Merrick's hands closed around the child's throat like a silk ribbon tightening. His face remained placid, eyes unblinking. Joran let out a muffled gasp, instinctive, tiny fists flailing in confusion. But the pacifier, still between his lips, muffled the panic. A high-pitched wheeze escaped, but not enough to pierce the low drone of the aircraft. "Shh," Merrick whispered almost to himself, as if silencing a thought, not a life. The boy's limbs jerked, then stilled. 3 rows ahead, the father of another toddler turned slightly in his seat, brow furrowed in restless sleep, but sank back into slumber. In the cockpit, Captain Rylan Voss reached forward, fingers hovering over the autopilot interface, then paused. A flicker, movement in the reflection of the dark glass. Just a sleeve, barely visible in the dim glow of the exit light. At first, he assumed it was a passenger adjusting a blanket, but something didn't sit right. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes toward the slim security monitor mounted to his right, cycling between cabin views. Too slow, too grainy. No obvious signs of struggle. Still, the hairs at the back of his neck rose. He tapped the earpiece nestled behind his right lobe. "Crew status check, any movement near the front cabin?" His voice was calm, steady, but beneath it flowed a current of unease. No response came immediately. Just the hiss of silence. Merrick moved again. He released Joran, who was now semi-conscious, whimpering softly, tiny chest rising in jagged gulps. The flight attendant adjusted the blanket around him with eerie care, smoothing it as if tucking in a nephew. His expression remained unreadable, neither gleeful nor cold, but clinically detached. He turned to the next row. The child there, Kaylin, was asleep with one arm dangling off the side of the seat. Merrick crouched beside him, casting a long, narrow shadow over the small frame. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering for the briefest moment. He reached out, but this time a sound caught in his throat. It was a growl, distant, soft. He froze. Far below, in the sealed cargo hold, a creature stirred Fenrir. K9, trained for airborne tactical intervention, twitched in his crate, muscles flexing beneath the reinforced padding. Though confined, his senses were honed far beyond the average animal. His ears rotated, pinpointing a disturbance. No scent, no noise specific, but a shift in atmosphere, like the scent of smoke before the fire. Security Officer Leon Vey sat in the rear observation station near the galley, monitoring pressure levels and cabin reports. His gaze drifted to the small digital feed linked to Fenrir's crate. The dog's body language had changed. Breathing heavier, legs tense, head down. Leon frowned. He tapped the console. "Rylan, this is Vey. Fenrir's acting up." Rylan blinked. "Explain." Low growls, restless. He only does that when something's off. Like, really off. Rylan didn't respond for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly. "Copy that. Keep him on standby." In row 10B, Merrick extended both hands toward Kaylin, fingers forming the same silent grip. But just as he touched the boy's throat, a second sound cut through the air, a sharper, clearer whimper from Joran behind him. Not loud, but just enough. Merrick turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing. In the cockpit, Rylan rose from his chair. No alarms had sounded. No pressure drops. No electronic disturbance. Yet he felt it, beneath the machinery, beneath the noise, something real and wrong. He peered through the narrow crack in the cockpit door, barely ajar, and caught a shimmer of movement near the cribs. A hand, a small hand being forced back under a blanket. He straightened sharply. "Merrick," he called, voice carrying just enough to reach down the aisle. No answer. "Merrick, respond." Nothing. He pushed the door open wider. Stepping out in the rear, Leon unlocked the control panel beside him. Fenrir's crate released with a subtle hiss, internal restraints disengaging. The dog stirred fully now, rising like a silent shadow, muscles taut. Back in the aisle, Merrick stiffened. His head turned slowly, calculating, listening. And Rylan whispered under his breath, as tension coiled tighter in his chest, "He's closer than I think." The moment Kale's gasp broke the quiet of the cabin, Fenrir's body reacted before any human mind could process the threat. The K9's paws twitched, claws scraping lightly against the metal crate in the cargo hold as his nostrils flared with instinctive awareness. A low growl rumbled in his chest, soft but sharp enough to draw the attention of Security Officer Leon Vey stationed in the monitoring pod. Leon straightened in his seat, eyes narrowing as he leaned toward the sound sensor. Fenrir never stirred without reason. "Easy, boy. What do you sense?" Leon whispered, though his tone carried more tension than calm. His fingers hovered over the control panel, watching the subtle shift in Fenrir's breathing through the live feed. The dog's muscles contracted, ears twitching toward the ceiling, toward the cabin where shadows moved with unnatural intent. Up above, the threat was already unfolding. Rylan Voss scanned the feed at the corner of his cockpit display, adjusting the lighting settings to investigate what had caught his eye moments earlier. A faint movement, too precise to be turbulence vibration, had drawn his attention. He replayed the last 10 seconds, watching a shadow slide over the crib row like a hand brushing across glass. The captain's brow tightened as he leaned closer, breath stiffening in his throat. "That wasn't lighting," he murmured, voice barely audible. His hand hovered over the cabin intercom switch, torn between protocol and instinct. In the dim cabin, Merrick Halden glided between rows with an eerie calm, his footsteps silent, his shadow stretching across blankets and tiny bodies. When he reached the crib where Cale lay, he leaned forward with the stillness of a predator, placing one palm gently, too gently, along the child's neck. The boy's eyes fluttered open, confusion pooling into fear as the grip tightened, cutting off his breath before he could form a sound. Cale's father stirred in the seat beside him, half-conscious, shifting as if sensing something wrong, but exhaustion dragged him back into uneasy sleep. Merrick's fingers pressed firmer. At the same instant, Rylan caught another flicker. This time, not a trick of his eyes, but a sleeve moving at an angle no crew member would ever move naturally. His pulse quickened. "That's not right," he whispered. He activated the intercom, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Crew, perform a quiet aisle check. Repeat, quiet aisle check, now." His tone was calm, but the pressure behind it betrayed urgency. His co-pilot glanced at him, puzzled. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Rylan answered, grabbing the edge of the control panel as he rose slightly from his seat. "But something in that cabin isn't normal." Meanwhile, in the cargo hold, Fenrir's growl deepened. His eyes snapped open, glowing faintly under the emergency light strips. The dog stood, body rigid and tail straightened like a spear. His senses sharpened instantly. Heartbeat patterns above him. The shift of weight, the silent struggle between a child's small body and an adult's tightening grip. Leon leaned closer to the monitor. "What is it, Fenrir? Talk to me." The dog's reaction was unmistakable. Danger. Immediate. Above. Leon's hand hovered over the K9 release authorization but hesitated. Protocol demanded confirmation, but instinct screamed louder, echoing the same unease Rylan felt in the cockpit. Up in the cabin, Rylan stepped out just enough to peer into the dim aisle. He caught the faint motion again. This time he knew. This was deliberate movement, not maintenance, not turbulence, not fatigue. The shadows were bending around something, masking the wrong person doing the wrong thing. Panic crawled up his spine, though he hid it beneath a facade of control. The hum of the engines was suddenly too loud, the quiet breathing of passengers too fragile. Every second he waited, another child was at risk. "I need eyes in the cabin." "Now," he whispered urgently into the internal channel. He felt the stakes tightening around him like a coiled wire parents slept, unaware of the creeping danger. Children lay defenseless, breaths shallow, surrounded by the illusion of safety that no longer existed. Dramatic irony tightened around the moment. The threat was closer than anyone realized, and only two men, and one dog far beneath their feet, felt its weight. Rylan inhaled sharply, jaw locking with decision. He knew hesitation could cost lives, and the window to act was shrinking fast. His fingers curled around the doorframe as he prepared to step fully into the aisle, heart pounding with the knowledge that every second mattered. And as the reality of the unfolding threat settled over him, a chilling thought echoed in his mind. If I don't act fast, it will be too late. A small hand twitched. Captain Rylan Voss saw it. Not imagined, saw it. Through the thin sliver between seatbacks and shadows, his trained eye had caught the unmistakable glint of fingers being forcibly pressed down by someone standing in the aisle. He didn't hesitate. Rylan left the cockpit without a word to his co-pilot, stepping into the faint blue glow of the cabin's night mode lighting. It was quiet, eerily so. Just the hum of engines, soft snoring, and the occasional creak of a shifting seat. Most passengers were deep in sleep, their heads resting on neck pillows or slumped against loved ones, but one figure was still moving with unnatural calmness. Merrick Halden. The flight attendant stood midway through the cabin, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his right hand lingered a moment too long over the bassinet tucked beside a sleeping man. The baby inside was stirring, eyes fluttering, lips parting for a silent cry. Merrick's head tilted slightly as if listening for something only he could hear, and his fingers adjusted the corner of the blanket. A slight pressure. A test. In the rear security hold, Officer Leon Vey had already noticed something was wrong. His K9 partner, Fenrir, had risen from his curled sleeping position, ears perked, muscles coiled. The alert panel pulsed yellow as Fenrir emitted a low, guttural growl. Leon leaned forward, brow furrowing. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, tapping a button to activate the silent alert mode. A second later, Fenrir's internal guidance system blinked green. The K9's stare fixed on the invisible heat signature moving near row 19. And then he moved, but not to the floor. Fenrir rose into the overhead bin. With the stealth of a predator bred for precision, he waited in silence, crouched, eyes gleaming through the ventilation slots. Only Leon knew he was there, and only Leon controlled when he would be unleashed. Back in the aisle, Merrick straightened. His path curved gently toward the rear rows, hands loosely clasped behind him in a professional stance, but his eyes betrayed him, darting to the rows with sleeping infants, calculating, measuring intervals, observing weakness. The captain followed, keeping a row's distance, pretending to check cabin panels. A toddler whimpered near 20 centimeters. Merrick paused, lowering himself slowly, delicately. His fingers hovered again, reaching toward a pacifier that had slipped from a baby's lips. The hand that touched the child's chin trembled, not with care, but control. The child stirred, coughed softly, and Merrick's thumb curled with slow pressure along the infant's jawline. Leon's voice, calm and clipped, spoke into the intercom from the rear security panel. "Captain Voss, do you copy? Fenrir has visual on the target position locked." Ryland's jaw tightened. He didn't respond verbally. Instead, he stepped forward 2 rows, now directly in line with Merrick, though still behind him. The soft lighting overhead cast a web of shadows across the cabin floor, and through the seat gaps, Ryland could see a father's foot twitch, but not enough to wake. The perfect storm of deep sleep and soft hums had masked every quiet assault. Until now. Ryland's breath caught as Merrick reached into his coat pocket. Something small, something metallic glinting briefly in his hand. A clip? A coil? He couldn't tell, but it was hidden again just as fast. His fingers now hovered over another child's blanket, fingertips brushing the neckline. In the overhead bin, Fenrir's eyes locked. Leon pressed the release command. The latch disengaged with a click so subtle it was drowned by engine noise. Fenrir tensed. Raylan took a slow step forward, glancing again to confirm what he'd seen earlier. A child's arm, too still, awkwardly angled, a gentle tremor in the wrist. That wasn't normal. He whispered under his breath, barely audible. "He's doing something." Below, Merrick shifted again, turning toward the rear. He had no idea what followed him from above. The K9 in the bin moved silently into strike position. His claws barely made a sound against the plastic interior. Leon monitored heart rates, movement vectors, and thermal signatures from his panel. Fenrir's timing was everything. Merrick continued, stopping beside a pair of twins sleeping head-to-head in bassinets beside each other. His lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, more a flicker of triumph. He reached for the first. That's when Ryland's voice cut across the aisle, low and deadly firm. "Sir, step away from the children." Merrick's back stiffened. He turned slowly, and that same polite facade painted across his face. "Captain," he said with perfect calm, "is there a problem?" Ryland nodded at the twins. "You tell me." A flicker passed across Merrick's eyes, his right hand twitching toward his coat again. His mouth opened, perhaps to offer a lie, but it never made it out. From the overhead bin above him, Fenrir exploded into motion. A blur of black and muscle and fury dropped directly behind the flight attendant, hitting the aisle with a thud that made the seats tremble. Passengers stirred. One man gasped awake. A baby cried out, and Merrick turned just in time to meet the K-9's unblinking stare, tense, locked, silent. He took one instinctive step back, eyes wide now, breath hitching. Ryland's heart pounded. Fenrir didn't lunge yet. He waited, low and ready, a creature carved from patience and precision. Leon's voice crackled over the secure line. "He's in position. Your call, Captain." Ryland slowly stepped around the row, placing himself between Merrick and the children. "This ends tonight," Ryland said, eyes locked on the man in front of him. "One way or another." Merrick reached the twins with both hands already closing in, his fingers tightening around their small necks with a cold, deliberate precision, when the overhead bin above him exploded open. A violent thud cracked through the cabin, followed by a deep, primal growl that split the silence like a blade. Fenrir launched downward with the full force of a trained guardian, his shadow streaking across the dim aisle as passengers jolted awake in confusion and fear. The twins' father, startled from sleep, sat up so fast his seatbelt dug into his ribs, eyes widening at the sight of a trained K-9 barreling toward the man hovering over his children. "What is happening?" he gasped, voice trembling, his hand shaking as he reached for his sons. The growl ripped through the cabin again, louder, sharper, making every adult twist in their seats. Some men shot to their feet, gripping armrests, while others froze mid-breath, their eyes flicking between the K-9 and the unmoving figure of Merrick. At the front of the plane, Ryland heard the commotion break through the cockpit door like distant thunder. His heart stopped for a second, then another. He abandoned the controls and sprinted into the cabin. "Merrick, step back," he shouted, each word bursting from him like a warning flare, his voice firm, commanding, terrified. But Merrick didn't move. His hands hovered over the twins, fingers still curled, eyes wide with shock as Fenrir's paws hit the floor and slid across the aisle. The impact rocked the cabin. The smell of recycled air mixed with fear, sweat, and the metallic tang of adrenaline as the K-9's claws scraped against the tiles. Parents screamed. Infants wailed. Grown men shouted for someone, anyone, to take control. Ryland felt the cabin tilt slightly as the plane hit a soft pocket of turbulence, but he kept his balance. He stared at Merrick, watching the man's frozen expression melt into confusion, then terror, then fury. "Get the dog away!" Merrick barked, voice cracking, his body recoiling as Fenrir stepped closer with measured, lethal discipline. His tone held the panic of someone whose perfect plan had shattered before his eyes. He stumbled backward, almost tripping over a stroller wedged beneath a seat. Fenrir advanced with trained calculation, growling from deep in his chest, the sound vibrating through the air like a warning of what was about to come. Merrick raised his hands instinctively, palms shaking, breathing uneven, eyes darting in every direction as the passengers' terrified whispers filled the cabin. "He's losing control," one man whispered urgently to another, his hands clutching the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned pale. "That's not normal behavior for a crew member." Ryland scanned the cabin quickly, assessing the danger. The twins were now in their father's arms, pressed tightly against his chest. Other parents clutched their children, shielding them with trembling bodies. The dim cabin lights flickered again, casting sharp shadows across Merrick's face, shadows that made him look less human and more unhinged. Ryland took a slow step forward, voice steady. "Merrick, look at me. This ends now. Step back." But Merrick's eyes had shifted. Something in him snapped at the sight of Fenrir blocking his path. He lunged, not toward the children this time, but toward the aisle, trying to outrun the K-9's reach. Chairs rattled. A water bottle rolled across the floor. Someone shouted, "Get security!" But Fenrir was faster. The K-9 leapt again, jaws open not to tear but to intimidate, body slamming into Merrick's side. The cabin erupted around them. Shouts collided with cries of terror. The sound of impact echoed against the metal walls as Merrick stumbled, clutching his ribs, falling hard against a seat. Rylan rushed forward, adrenaline burning through him. For a split second he wondered how long Merrick had planned this, how deeply he had hidden this darkness, how many nights he had rehearsed each step. The realization made Rylan's stomach twist. Merrick tried to rise, fingers clawing at the seat back, but Fenrir blocked him again, growling with surgical focus. Rylan seized the moment, lunging to grab Merrick's wrist before he could escape. Their bodies collided, sending a wave of motion through the nearby seats. Sweat dripped down Rylan's face. The plane vibrated beneath them, engines humming steadily as if unaware of the chaos erupting inside. Passengers watched in helpless shock as the three forces, Captain, Predator, Guardian, clashed in the narrow aisle. Merrick's breath grew ragged, his eyes darting wildly between Rylan and Fenrir. The K-9's teeth flashed, stopping just inches from Merrick's throat. It was enough. The final fracture hit Merrick's confidence. His plan was gone. His control was slipping. And now, with a trained Guardian blocking every escape, he felt something he had not expected to feel tonight. Fear. The twins' father held his sons tighter, whispering shaky thanks under his breath. Other men moved their bodies forward protectively, forming a barrier between their families and the threat. The entire cabin seemed to pulse with tension, every heartbeat synchronized, every breath suspended. Merrick realized with dawning horror that he was no longer the hunter in the dark. He was the one being hunted. His gaze trembled as he looked up at Fenrir, understanding too late what he had underestimated. His hands rose slowly in surrender, fingers shaking not from defeat, but from disbelief that a creature he had never even seen coming had ended everything. The moment held like a stretched wire, tight, fragile, ready to snap. And then, as the entire cabin watched in stunned silence, the truth settled in the air like a final verdict. The Predator met his match in the unlikeliest form. Merrick lunged backward, knocking into a service cart as Fenrir snapped at his arm, stopping just short of piercing skin. The metal tray clattered loudly, jolting more passengers from sleep. The flight attendant's breath was ragged, his eyes wild with a mixture of panic and disbelief. He had prepared for every contingency, except this. He hadn't accounted for the snarling beast that now blocked his escape, nor the chaos that was rapidly spreading like fire through the cabin. Fenrir's stance was calculated, low to the ground, legs bent, shoulders square, his head angled just enough to show the teeth he'd been trained to use only with precision. His growl reverberated through the fuselage, low and unwavering. Behind him, children screamed, some too young to understand the threat, others old enough to sense its horror. A boy with a buzz cut and a blue pacifier stared, paralyzed in silence, as his father reached desperately to unbuckle his seatbelt and shield him. Rylan gripped the cockpit threshold with one hand and the cabin wall with the other, using his weight to swing into the aisle. The emergency lights glowed red, pulsing with urgency, casting shadows that made it harder to distinguish ally from enemy. But his instincts were clear now. There was no doubt. The flight attendant, who had moved like a ghost through the night, was the source of terror unraveling beneath them. "Merrick, stand down," Rylan shouted, his voice cutting through the frenzy like a blade. "You're done. The plan's over." But Merrick wasn't listening. He twisted his body, arms flailing as he reached behind him, trying to find something, anything, to gain leverage. His hand brushed against a dropped juice bottle that rolled beneath a row of seats. He didn't notice the small girl's trembling fingers inches away, clutching her teddy bear. He didn't care. Fenrir advanced another step. Merrick lashed out with a broken plastic tray divider, jabbing it forward in a desperate attempt to create space. But Fenrir was faster. He dodged left, then lunged forward with stunning speed, his body colliding with Merrick's chest and forcing him back against the aisle seats. The flight attendant grunted as he hit the edge, his body buckling. The divider clattered harmlessly to the ground. Parents leapt from their seats now, shielding their children, covering faces, pulling others close. Leon's voice crackled through the security channel in Ryland's earpiece. "Maintain pressure. Fenrir has visual lock. Don't let him retreat to the rear galley. It's too confined." "Understood," Ryland said through clenched teeth, already moving. Merrick scrambled again, this time kicking over another cart in the aisle trying to build a barricade. Snacks, cups, and a rain of napkins burst into the air, but it only made him more visible. Fenrir moved like liquid steel, circling, anticipating. The captain raised both hands in a gesture of command, shouting over the mounting noise. "Everyone stay seated. Crew, secure your stations." But the instructions barely registered. The plane had become a battleground. A father pulled his infant into his chest and ducked below the window line. Another man used his own body as a shield, crouched beside the legs of his toddler. No one had ever imagined needing protection from a flight attendant, and yet here they were, facing something unspeakable in the very space they once trusted. Merrick gasped for breath as his eyes darted wildly, looking for a gap in the wall of resistance. He was losing time, losing control, losing the narrative. "You don't understand," he hissed, voice cracking. "I was cleansing. I was correcting what the world refuses to—" "Save it," Ryland growled. He moved forward with surgical focus, body low, hands ready, eyes never leaving the target. His brain had already mapped out 3 containment routes, fallback options, and pressure points to use if Merrick lunged again. Fenrir tensed. The flight attendant hesitated, hands halfway raised like a man unsure whether to beg or strike. Then, a sudden shift, he dropped to a crouch and spun, attempting to dive beneath a row of seats. But Fenrir's training activated in a heartbeat. The K-9 slammed forward, paws digging into Merrick's shoulder blades, pinning him flat against the floor. There was no blood, no savage tearing. Just the overwhelming, merciless weight of a protector who had waited long enough. From the rear, a low voice boomed through the intercom. "Leon, target isolated. Do not interfere. Stand clear." The cabin obeyed. Ryland rushed forward, eyes sharp, breath shallow. He passed crying children, wide-eyed teens, and trembling hands. Every detail etched itself into his memory. The cracked oxygen masks, the spilled soda slicking the floor, the old man near row 22 holding a rosary with white knuckles. He reached Fenrir, now crouched with perfect stillness over Merrick's back. The flight attendant squirmed weakly, but the K-9's jaw hovered inches from his neck, a silent promise of consequence if the struggle resumed. Ryland dropped to one knee beside them, reaching for the restraint belt on his uniform. "You thought this was your moment," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but you forgot who was watching." He snapped the restraint loop around Merrick's wrists, cinching it with finality. Behind them, the engine hum carried on steady, unyielding, just like the men now in control. Children sobbed against their parents' shoulders. Some whispered questions no one could answer yet, but the threat was contained, and the predator caged. Ryland stood slowly, every muscle in his body alert but no longer burning with panic. He glanced down at Fenrir, whose tail thumped the floor once, an acknowledgement, not a celebration. Then he looked across the cabin, meeting the stunned eyes of fathers, brothers, sons, and grandfathers who had just learned that guardianship takes many forms. And in that quiet pause, the line echoed again in his mind, simple, certain, and final. "No one harms these children tonight, not while I'm awake." Merrick Halden's breath rasped as he burst toward the galley, one arm shielding his face while the other flailed for balance. Trays clattered to the floor, metal utensils ricocheting off the narrow aisle walls, cups exploded in sprays of orange juice and soda, staining the carpet and soaking into passengers' shoes. Children screamed. Parents rose in panic, but Merrick didn't stop. He couldn't. Sweat poured from his forehead, blurring his vision, his polished calm now stripped to raw desperation. His plan was slipping fast through his fingers, unraveling in front of a dozen witnesses. From behind, the heavy thud of padded paws landed like judgment Fenrir. The K9 unit moved like a shadow-given form, launching from the rear section with staggering speed and grace. Leon Vey, positioned near the emergency equipment locker, kept one hand subtly raised, issuing near-invisible commands through a specialized glove fitted with haptic sensors. Each flick of a finger told Fenrir what to anticipate, where to redirect, how to intercept. The coordination between man and dog was nearly telepathic. Merrick didn't see it, but Ryland did. From the edge of the cockpit, Captain Ryland Voss caught the flash of the dog's lean body weaving between rows, angling not to kill, but to trap. He leaned forward instinctively, one hand braced against the overhead bin, and shouted, "Back! Everyone stay in your seats!" His voice was sharp, thunderous, unmistakable, a command meant not just for compliance but for protection. Merrick slammed his hip into the beverage cart mid-sprint, sending it toppling into the aisle. His eyes flicked toward the emergency door near the galley. He calculated quickly, if he could pry the panel open and activate the lever, even partially, the pressure alarm would trigger and force Ryland to abandon the cabin to resecure it. It would buy him time. Maybe enough, maybe not. But it was all he had left. A warning growl halted him mid-step. Fenrir had cleared the obstacle and now stood directly in the aisle, his body lowered, muscles coiled like spring steel, teeth barely bared. His stare never wavered from Merrick's trembling frame. The dog's presence was uncanny, too disciplined to attack without order, too fierce to let anyone pass. Merrick's hands twitched. He took a cautious step back and collided with the wall behind him. His confidence had already cracked back near row 12, but now it shattered entirely. Every escape route he'd planned, every blind spot he thought he could exploit was gone. The crew wasn't paralyzed by panic as he'd expected. They were coordinated, intentional. Worse, they were ahead of him. "Leon," Ryland called over the chaos. "Seal the cockpit hall. Don't let him near that panel." Leon's voice responded through comms. "Already done. Fenrir's locking him down." Merrick pivoted sharply, eyes darting. He spotted a loose oxygen mask dangling from an open panel. A child's safety demonstration unit had fallen during the earlier disruption. He lunged, grabbing it by the tubing, twisting it into a makeshift whip. The plastic mask clutched like a club. Passengers gasped. Someone screamed. A baby cried. But Ryland was faster. He launched himself forward with the force of urgency honed by experience, crossed the distance between cockpit and galley in seconds, and intercepted Merrick mid-swing. His hand snapped up, catching the wrist holding the mask and twisting it sharply. Merrick's grip loosened, the tubing slithering to the floor as the mask clattered across the cabin like a discarded lie. "Drop it," Ryland growled through clenched teeth, his face inches from Merrick's, his eyes burning with fury not for himself, but for the children, for every quiet breath nearly stolen, for every sleeping parent who had no idea they'd been seconds from losing everything. Merrick struggled weakly, his body beginning to fold. He was a man built on silence, control, and shadows. But under this light, under Ryland's glare, Leon's strategy, and Fenrir's unwavering stare, he was nothing more than a man cornered by truth. Passengers looked on, wide-eyed, some standing but too afraid to intervene. The cabin was still trembling from the turbulence of fear, yet something had shifted. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were beginning to understand. The danger had never been external. It had been walking among them, serving drinks, folding blankets, brushing fingers across their babies' foreheads. And now, that threat was being methodically dismantled before their eyes. Raylan took a breath, steady but sharp, and nodded at Leon, who signaled Fenrir to advance a half-step, pressing the intruder back toward the cabin wall. Merrick glanced down, understanding too late that there would be no negotiation, no clever lie, no slithering away through protocol loopholes. Rylan adjusted his grip, holding Merrick steady with calm, practiced force. Then, quietly, so only Merrick could hear it, he said with grim certainty, Every plan has a weakness, and tonight his was underestimating us. He crept from row to row, tightening grips, whispering like a predator in control. Unaware, the dog's leap had already been calculated to end his reign of terror. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always meets its reckoning, hit subscribe now, because justice hunts with precision. Merrick screamed, "Cabin pressure's dropping! We're losing air! Cover the children!" His voice echoed through the cabin with such urgency that several parents immediately reached for oxygen masks, their instincts overtaking logic. One man shouted in confusion, "Is this real?" while another began pressing the call button repeatedly. But Ryland Voss didn't flinch. From the cockpit doorway, the captain's eyes locked onto Merrick's. He saw it for what it was, a lie born of desperation, weaponized to turn chaos into opportunity. Ryland's hand moved quickly to the cabin intercom. "Everyone, stay seated. Cabin pressure is stable. Do not remove your seatbelts. I repeat, remain calm and await crew instructions." His voice was steady, authoritative. It cut through the fear like a scalpel. But Merrick wasn't finished. He twisted around and shoved a food cart to the side, scattering meal trays and utensils in his path. A fork skidded under a passenger's seat, while juice cartons splattered against the walls. He sprinted toward the front, toward the exit doors, but Fenrir's growl halted him mid-stride. The K-9 lunged, teeth bared, but held back by Leon Vey's precise directional command from the rear console. The dog didn't bite. Not yet. He herded Merrick like a wolf driving prey into open ground. The flight attendant stumbled, collided with a row divider, then fell hard onto his shoulder. The passengers gasped, their panic teetering on the edge of terror. Merrick rose again, this time waving his arms wildly. "They've sealed us in. They're trying to suffocate the cabin. The crew is lying." His voice cracked. Spit flew from his lips as desperation overtook strategy. "You have to help me. Your children aren't safe. They're in on it." But no one moved. No one believed him anymore. The dramatic irony hung thick in the air. This man, so confident just minutes ago, had relied on panic to cloak his intentions. Yet the more he yelled, the more obvious his guilt became. Parents clutched their children tighter. Some stood between Merrick and their families like shields, eyes full of rage and disbelief. "Get down on the ground," Ryland barked, now striding fully into the cabin, his voice the calm center of the storm. "I did what I had to," Merrick shouted back, chest heaving. "No one understands what they are, what they'll become." His words made no sense. Fenrir advanced, tail stiff, muscles wound like coiled springs. Each of his paws landed silently on the carpeted floor, but the presence he carried was thunderous. Merrick flinched at the sound of his own breath. His composure fracturing Leon's voice came softly through Ryland's earpiece. "Ready for full takedown. One motion, your call." Ryland didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked between the passengers, the children's tear-streaked faces, and the man who had nearly stolen everything under the veil of professionalism. "Merrick Halden," he said, voice hardening, "you are no longer in control." The K-9's growl intensified. Still, Merrick tried one last gambit. He dropped to his knees, hands up in mock surrender, then lunged for a dangling oxygen mask with his left hand. In one fluid motion he yanked it down and swung it like a weighted lasso, aiming for Ryland's face. But Ryland had anticipated it. He ducked under the arc and drove his shoulder into Merrick's torso, sending both of them tumbling backward into the center aisle. The mask flew from Merrick's grip and clattered uselessly beside a child's sneaker. Before Merrick could rise again, Fenrir was there, front paws slamming into the flight attendant's chest, pinning him flat. The dog's jaws hovered just inches from Merrick's neck, teeth bared but still controlled. Ryland stood above them, breathing hard but composed. Parents watched in stunned silence, their emotions a storm of relief and fury. Merrick writhed once, but the K-9 didn't budge. "You tried to break them," Ryland said quietly, but they held stronger than you ever expected. From behind, Leon approached with handcuffs in one hand and a tranquilizer backup in the other. His eyes scanned the scene, then met Ryland's with a nod. The entire cabin seemed to exhale at once. The moment was tense, but it had shifted. Merrick's attempt to manipulate through fear had backfired spectacularly, exposing him not as a figure of authority or cunning, but as a desperate, unraveling man undone by the very unity he tried to dismantle. And the K-9 never took his eyes off him. The scene settled into a strange, suspended calm. The children were safe, for now. The parents remained on edge, but trust in Ryland and his crew began to solidify with quiet power. The plane flew on, and as Ryland turned toward the passengers and spoke again, his voice low and measured, the crew prepared the next move. Chaos meets control, and tonight the children will be safe. Fenrir struck with terrifying precision. The silence of the cabin shattered as the trained K-9 launched from the aisle like a living missile, muscles coiled with disciplined force. Merrick Halden barely had time to turn before Fenrir's full weight hit his torso, knocking him backward onto the carpeted floor with a sickening thud. The sound was sharp, final, an audible punctuation to the chaos that had rippled through the plane moments earlier. His limbs flailed instinctively, but Fenrir was already atop him, his jaws parted just enough to threaten, not maim, his teeth glinting inches from the man's throat. The growl, rumbling from Fenrir's chest, was low, steady, and chilling in its control. It wasn't rage, it was a warning. From the cockpit, Captain Ryland Voss heard the thud, followed by gasps and the shuffle of feet. He burst into the cabin. "Status," he barked, his eyes scanning the scene in seconds. Leon Vey, already moving fast from the rear galley, gave a sharp nod. Subject down, secured by Fenrir, proceeding to restrain. Passengers recoiled in their seats, some shielding their children, others frozen in disbelief. The quiet night flight had turned into a surreal nightmare. One father sobbed silently, clutching his child tighter, while another man stood shakily, unsure whether to help or stay back. Merrick twisted beneath the dog's powerful grip, gasping for air, his voice hoarse. "Get it off me," he shrieked, but the words cracked with more fear than anger. "Don't move," Leon warned sharply as he knelt beside him. "You're lucky he's trained not to break bones." Fenrir didn't blink. The K-9's entire body was taut with control. Ears pinned back, front paws pinning Merrick's chest, and his eyes locked on his target with unwavering focus. There was no panic in the dog, only purpose. Ryland moved beside them, grabbing a restraint kit from the emergency wall panel. He crouched next to Leon, unspooling the cuffs with practiced efficiency. "Hold steady, Fenrir," he commanded firmly. Merrick thrashed again, but one low snarl from the dog froze him in place. The flight attendant's eyes darted around the cabin, desperate for an ally, anyone. But all he saw were faces twisted in horror and disbelief. There would be no help. No one would intervene on his behalf. The man who had once moved silently through the aisles, unseen and unsuspected, now lay exposed under the eyes of every passenger. Every secret he had guarded was dissolving in front of him, unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. "Cuffs," Leon said, and Ryland clamped them onto Merrick's wrists swiftly, double-checking the lock. As the metal clicked shut, Merrick's body slackened slightly, the final confirmation that the plan he had spent months crafting had failed. Around them, fathers stood, holding their children, faces pale and trembling. One man, young, maybe 30, whispered, "Is it over?" His voice cracked with a kind of innocence lost in real time. "For now," Ryland replied without looking up, securing the second cuff. "But don't let your guard down." The captain looked around the cabin. The quiet had returned, but it was brittle, sharp-edged, the kind of silence that followed a storm, not peace but stunned reprieve. He stood slowly and moved row by row, eyes scanning each child's face. He knelt by a toddler who had a faint bruise on his collarbone and signaled for one of the other male crew members to bring a first aid kit. Leon kept a hand on Fenrir's collar as the K-9 finally stepped off Merrick, still alert but no longer in attack stance. The flight attendant lay in a sweat-soaked heap, chest heaving, cuffs biting into his wrists, eyes darting with the last flickers of defiance. But it was gone. He knew it. The darkness he had cloaked himself in was gone, pierced by training, timing, and something he had never accounted for. Loyalty. "You planned this," Merrick hissed, voice shaking. "You knew I'd try something." "No," Ryland said, kneeling down, eyes level with him. "We didn't know you, but we prepared for someone like you." Merrick said nothing. Across the aisle, a father hugged his child so tightly the boy winced. Another man fell to his knees, praying under his breath. In the quiet corners of the plane, some passengers wept openly, not out of pain, but out of the horrifying realization of what nearly happened. Leon, still beside Merrick, finally spoke. "You thought silence was your weapon," he said coldly, "but tonight it turned against you." A whisper passed through the cabin. "The dog saved us." It rippled from row to row like folklore being born in real time. Some passengers stared at Fenrir in awe, others in reverence, but none could deny what they had witnessed. Back in the cockpit, systems remained normal, but Ryland's hand stayed on the comms. He looked back once more toward the restrained man now lying flat, and then toward the passengers, still shaken but safe. He exhaled for the first time in minutes. One father approached quietly, holding his son, and said, "Thank you. Thank you for not hesitating." Ryland only nodded. There was no victory here, just averted tragedy. As the cabin lights returned to a steady glow, Leon activated the signal for emergency assistance upon landing. He tapped into the crew channel. "We'll need a security escort. The threat is contained." Behind him, Fenrir sat perfectly still, posture proud and alert, eyes still locked forward. Merrick did not speak again, and though fear still lingered in the stale air of the cabin, it was no longer growing. It was retreating. Witnesses in the cabin whispered about the K-9's almost supernatural precision, unaware of the meticulous planning behind the security program. The first real sense of relief swept through the plane as calm began to return. Order reclaimed, predator contained, and innocence preserved. The cabin was silent, but it was not peace, it was tension sharpened to a needle's edge. Merrick Halden lay pinned to the floor beneath layers of reinforced restraint straps, his breathing ragged, eyes darting wildly in the dim overhead lights. Fenrir, the K-9, remained planted just inches from the man's face, teeth bared in a low, steady growl, his muscles coiled like wire. The flight had not yet landed, and though the initial storm had passed, the aftermath still howled beneath the surface. Every passenger sat frozen in place, the weight of what had almost occurred pressing down on them like altitude pressure against their ribs. Captain Ryland Voss moved methodically down the aisle, stepping over scattered debris, overturned trays, rolling bottles, a child's toy truck now stuck beneath a seat. His hands stayed steady despite the chaos that had unfolded only minutes prior. He knelt beside a crying child in 14B, a boy no older than 2, whose face was pale with fear but otherwise unharmed. Ryland met the father's eyes, a silent nod passing between them. No words were needed, just confirmation. The boy was safe. Across the cabin, Leon Vey stood watchfully near the galley, one hand gripping Fenrir's harness now that the K-9 had fulfilled his task. The dog's ears still twitched at every metallic creak and whisper of motion, hyper-aware, hyper-alive. Leon's face was unreadable, but inside, 1,000 calculations pulsed. He had seen Fenrir work in war zones and security theaters, but never on a commercial airliner, and never with such precision under such claustrophobic conditions. Fenrir hadn't just reacted, he had anticipated. That made the hair on Leon's neck stand. Rylan rose and tapped the side of his earpiece. "Control, this is Flight 914, he said calmly. "Request immediate law enforcement response upon arrival at Havenport. Suspect subdued. Cabin secured. No casualties, but multiple miners emotionally distressed." Over. There was a beat of static, then a voice replied, clipped and official. "Copy that. Flight 914 ground units already en route. Secure suspect until handoff. Maintain cabin protocol. ETA 16 minutes. Reedlin exhaled through his nose. 16 minutes, he repeated under his breath. 16 more to hold this together. He turned back to the passengers. Parents rocked babies, cradled toddlers, or held trembling hands in silence. Some wept quietly. Others remained in shock, too stunned to move. The air was thick, not just with recycled oxygen, but with the invisible residue of what might have been, "Is it over?" a voice whispered. A man in his early 40s, face lined with fatigue, held a little girl on his lap. "For now," Rylan answered, his voice low but firm. "He's restrained. You're safe." Near row 22, Merrick groaned. He twisted slightly under the restraints, lips curled in anger. "You don't understand," he spat. "This wasn't chaos, it was cleansing." Leon stepped forward, boots silent on the carpet. "You're done speaking," he said, voice steel. "Anything you say now only adds to the list of charges you're already wearing like a noose." Merrick chuckled, low and bitter. "I planned for variables," he muttered, "but I never saw the dog." "You never saw a lot of things," Rylan said from behind, his gaze cutting through the dark. "That's why you failed." The intercom buzzed faintly as Rylan keyed into the internal channel again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured and grounding, "we have contained the incident. You are safe. Please remain seated until we land. Assistance will be available immediately after arrival." Passengers nodded, some visibly relaxing at the captain's calm, others still on edge. A baby began to wail. Another child whimpered and reached for a stuffed animal lying near Merrick's foot. Leon noticed and, with surgical precision, used his boot to kick the toy gently across the aisle, returning it to its rightful owner without allowing his gaze to break from the restrained man. Throughout the cabin, murmurs began to grow. Whispered fragments floated between seats. The dog jumped from the ceiling. "I saw him fly straight from the bin like a ghost. I thought we were going to die. Did you see that man's face? He was smiling when he went for that child. The captain, he didn't even hesitate." Dramatic irony curled around every word. No one had known how close they'd been to tragedy. How methodically the plan had been set in motion. Merrick had walked among them, served them water, smiled at their children, and tucked in their blankets. And in that quiet trust, he had calculated his descent into horror. But that horror had met resistance, a kind of resistance that didn't come from luck or coincidence. It came from planning, discipline, and instinct sharpened into steel. Leon crouched beside Fenrir, stroking the K9's back slowly. "Good work," he murmured, more to himself than the dog. "You were the ace he never saw." In the far corner, a boy clutched his father's sleeve and whispered, "Was the dog magic?" Rylan overheard and paused, then smiled faintly. "No," he said softly, "just trained for the moment." Merrick's voice rose once more, angry now. "I was trying to fix the world. You fools don't even see it. They're the problem." "Enough," Rylan snapped. His tone was no longer controlled. It was final. "You don't speak for anything. You don't fix anything. You almost destroyed everything." Silence followed. Merrick's mouth moved, but no sound came. Perhaps he'd realized, belatedly, that every excuse had shattered against the wall of calm resistance. The plane began its descent. Outside the window, the first lights of Havenport flickered into view, distant and silent like stars against the black ocean of night. Raylan returned to the front, watching the blinking dots on his console. Beside him, the co-pilots prepared for landing. Glancing toward him with respect that didn't need words, Leon secured the last of the cabin, Fenrir sitting poised like a statue. The passengers stayed quiet, as if afraid that any sound might wake the nightmare again. But the nightmare was already bound, caged not just by straps, but by the truth of what had unfolded. That darkness had walked among them, but so had guardians. They thought they were safe, but tonight they saw the difference between luck and preparation. The moment the wheels of Flight 914 kissed the tarmac at Havenport International, a fleet of blue and white security vehicles surged forward from the far end of the runway. Sirens remained silent, but the urgency in their speed was unmistakable. Ryland Voss stood at the cabin threshold, his face expressionless, but his eyes sharp and scanning. His body remained tense, every breath measured. Fenrir stood beside Leon Vey, the K-9's ears alert, muscles coiled even after the struggle had ended. The cabin behind them buzzed with a strange hush, passengers whispering, children cradled close, parents blinking as if waking from a collective nightmare. The forward door cracked open with a hydraulic hiss, and 4 uniformed officers stepped aboard, their eyes immediately locking onto the restrained man in row 3A, Merrick Halden, once the picture of calm professionalism, now sat slouched, wrists secured, jaw clenched to hide the tremor in his lips. His uniform was disheveled, a smear of blood near his collarbone from Fenrir's precision takedown, but his expression had changed. The mask of confidence was gone. In its place, visible fear. "Take him," Ryland said, voice low but final. 2 officers approached, flanking Merrick without a word. As they lifted him from the seat, Merrick stumbled slightly. His legs shook, not from injury, but from the collapse of the control he'd believed he possessed. "I didn't hurt anyone," Merrick muttered, his voice a breathless protest. Leon stepped forward, his voice razor-sharp. "You intended to. You just didn't count on the dog." Fenrir let out a low, guttural growl as if to punctuate the point, his gaze locked on the man who now refused to look at him. The security team led Merrick down the mobile stairs into the flood of flashing cameras waiting at the base. Media had caught wind of an emergency-level detainment on a commercial flight with children involved. Reporters shouted questions, but Merrick didn't answer. He ducked his head, shrinking under the spotlight he once thought he'd never be caught in. Back on board, Ryland turned to his co-pilot, who had now joined him near the exit. "Take control of post-flight protocol. I need to start the report." "You sure you're good?" the co-pilot asked. Ryland gave a half-nod. "I'm sure, but I don't trust silence anymore." Leon was already speaking to airport investigators who boarded moments after the authorities had cleared the way. The lead agent, a stern-faced man named Darren Malice, walked slowly down the aisle, observing every detail, the overturned trays, the oxygen mask on the floor, the marks on the armrests. "We'll need a full sweep," Darren said. "Was the subject carrying anything?" Leon motioned toward the overhead bin above row 5. "Check there. We found traces of latex gloves. There may be more." Within minutes, a forensic team had descended on the aircraft. Black cases opened with clicks, swabs, lights, and fine brushes appeared. Passengers, now fully aware of the gravity of what had occurred, were ushered off the plane. Row by row, fathers held their sons tightly. One man clutched his infant, whispering calming words even though his own hands trembled. Ryland stood mid-cabin, speaking with parents, answering questions with careful precision. His goal was reassurance. But inside, his mind raced, replaying the moment he'd seen the glint of a child's hand forced down. The second he'd realized the flight attendant he trusted was a predator hiding in plain sight. Near the back, Fenrir sat like a statue beside Leon. The dog hadn't relaxed. He watched every movement, every voice, as if the threat might still be hiding in the shadows. Darren returned from the overhead bin holding a small canvas pouch. He unzipped it and carefully laid the contents on a tray table. Thin ropes, child-size cloth gags, and a vial of clear liquid with an unfamiliar label. Leon's jaw tightened. Sedatives. Ryland stared at the items, the full weight of what had almost happened settling in. He planned for silence, he said quietly. And stealth, Darren added grimly. But he didn't plan for resistance. Media attention exploded within the hour. News anchors broadcasted live outside the terminal as passengers were escorted into private rooms for statements. Parents spoke through tears about what they'd seen, or almost hadn't. Some mentioned the growl, how it cut through the quiet, how it woke them up before it was too late. Others spoke of Ryland's calm under pressure, or Leon's calculated coordination with Fenrir. All mentioned the dog. In the airport's security lounge, Ryland sat before an array of officials and investigators. A recorder blinked red on the table. He was systematic, Ryland said. He moved with intent, not chaos. He waited until lights dimmed when our guard was down, but something felt off even before it started. "You sensed him?" asked one agent. "No," Ryland replied. "I sensed absence, of intention. He looked busy, but nothing he did had purpose, until it did." Outside the glass wall, Leon paced with Fenrir at his heel. The dog had been checked, cleared, and praised by nearly every agency present. Yet he remained still, almost brooding, as if waiting for confirmation that it was truly over. Later that night, as the sun began to set beyond the terminal, Leon gathered his security team in a private meeting room. He clicked through footage from the onboard surveillance systems. Slow, grainy clips showed Merrick's movements, each approach to a crib, each deviation from standard procedure. "We'll adjust protocols," Leon said firmly. "More K9s, passive monitors in child zones, and surprise integrity checks on crew." One officer raised a hand. "Sir, do you think there are more like him?" Leon didn't answer immediately. He looked at Fenrir, whose eyes remained fixed on the doorway, as if expecting something, or someone, to return. "I think we plan as if there are," he said finally. Downstairs, Merrick was held in a temporary detainment cell. A lone officer monitored him while an audio recorder captured every word. "I planned for everything," Merrick said to no one in particular. "Every variable, every route, every cry that wouldn't be heard." He paused. Then, almost trembling, he whispered, "Except the dog." The story spread. Television stations ran specials on Fenrir's training. Articles praised Ryland's leadership. And still, in the quiet corners of the airport, the investigators kept digging because they knew something Merrick didn't. He wasn't the only one who believed in silence, and just above the whispers of fear, one truth echoed across the nation. Preparation and vigilance turned a nightmare into a story of salvation. The fallout began before the wheels of Flight 914 had fully cooled on the Havenport tarmac. News of the airborne incident, carried in fragments over radio chatter and emergency briefings, burst onto national headlines like lightning, K-9 thwarts in-flight attack, blared one outlet. Flight attendant targets children, stopped midair by security dog, read another. But behind the sensational headlines, the real story was far more complex, and for Ryland Voss, the days following the incident were anything but calm. Inside Arian Air's internal debriefing room, far from the media storm, Captain Ryland stood before a panel of company executives, safety inspectors, and federal transportation officials. His flight uniform was crisp, but his eyes carried the weight of everything that had happened. A large monitor displayed the cabin diagram from Flight 914, now marked with heat traces, timestamps, and digital red circles where Merrick Halden had attempted to strike. "The protocol wasn't improvised," Ryland said, voice steady but clipped. "It was the result of months of strategic layering. Leon Vey's K-9 unit wasn't there by coincidence. He was placed on that flight because of subtle markers we picked up in Merrick's behavior logs over time. Passive aggression, erratic schedule changes, unexplained maintenance access." The officials exchanged looks, nodding, but one of them, a sharp-eyed analyst named Daryl Keene, raised a hand. "Captain, are you suggesting that the company suspected Merrick Halden before this flight?" Rylan hesitated. "Not officially, but after what happened on Flight 914, we can no longer treat anomalies as harmless. There were signs. We just hadn't calibrated our system to flag them at the right intensity." Outside the briefing room, Leon Vey walked briskly down the corridor, Fenrir at his side. The K-9 trotted calmly, but the firm angle of his neck and constant alertness betrayed that his work wasn't over. Every few steps, Fenrir's ears twitched, reacting to voices behind closed doors or the mechanical hum of air vents. Though media hailed him as a hero, Leon refused every interview to him. Fenrir's performance was not spectacle. It was duty, fulfilled with precision. "Still alert, aren't you?" Leon murmured, kneeling beside the dog in the lobby. Fenrir's eyes never wavered from the nearby doors. "You felt it before any of us did." At the same time, inside a secure holding center in Havenport, Merrick Halden sat alone in an interview room. His wrists were cuffed, but his demeanor remained distant, neither angry nor afraid. A psychologist, Dr. Ronald Moret, sat across from him, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "You planned to do this," the doctor said slowly. "You rehearsed movements, studied sleep patterns, even memorized the flight manifest. That kind of calculation doesn't happen overnight." Merrick's head tilted. "It wasn't about hatred," he murmured, eyes blank. "It was about silence, about what people don't notice unless something forces them to." Renal paused. "You targeted children." Merrick's mouth twitched, neither a smile nor a frown. "Children aren't trained to pretend. They reveal everything, that's why they matter." The psychologist closed his folder. The diagnosis was growing clearer. Obsessive-compulsive behavioral patterns, heightened control fixation, and a disturbingly detached emotional response to harm. It wasn't madness. It was obsession sharpened into logic. Meanwhile, families from Flight 914 gathered at Arian Air's support center, where a crisis response team had assembled. A father, named Darren Cale, stood with his arms wrapped tightly around his toddler son, Cale, who hadn't spoken a word since the flight. His eyes followed Fenrir, who sat calmly in the hallway, completely still. "I didn't even wake up when he was leaning over my boy," Darren whispered, voice trembling. "I failed him, but that dog didn't." A security officer assured the father that the children would receive medical evaluations and psychological support, but Rylan, standing nearby, knew the deeper healing would take longer. He stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the man's shoulder. "You didn't fail him," Rylan said. "You trusted us to get you through the sky safely, and we did." Elsewhere, in conference rooms and government buildings, Rylan was summoned again and again, this time not to fly planes, but to explain exactly how Flight 914 didn't end in tragedy. In one closed-door session before a federal aviation safety board, he pointed to the value of dual-layered vigilance. "Technology helps, but instinct still matters," he explained. "We trusted Fenrir's behavior. When that dog sensed danger, we acted, even before the first alert. That's what saved lives." One senator leaned forward. "Are you suggesting every commercial flight should have a trained K-9 on board?" "No," Rylan replied. "But I'm saying we need to invest in systems that detect subtle human patterns, and dogs do that better than any device. What Fenrir did wasn't just impressive, it was necessary." Training programs across the aviation industry began requesting access to Arian Air's new procedural documents. Safety briefings shifted their focus, placing greater emphasis on psychological vetting of crew, layered response units, and the presence of K-9S in sensitive, long-haul routes. Leon, despite the growing attention, continued refining Fenrir's drills in private. He adjusted his protocols based on every second of the encounter, timing, movement, behavior anticipation. Reporters asked for interviews. TV hosts begged for features. He declined every offer. "This isn't about fame," Leon told Rylan over a late-night call. "It's about proving that vigilance works, that training works, and that silence isn't safety." In the weeks that followed, Fenrir received a formal medal from the National Aviation Council. Awarded in a private ceremony where no cameras were allowed, Rylan stood beside Leon, clapping quietly as the brass pin was fastened to Fenrir's service vest. The room applauded, but Leon kept his eyes on the dog, kneeling beside him, whispering only, "You did what no one else could." As the ceremony ended, a wall of news footage played silently on a screen. Clips of parents giving tearful testimonies, aviation analysts discussing the implications, and images of Flight 914 frozen in midair above a silver horizon. From that chaos, new safety procedures were born. From one dog's instinct, trust in unseen protection was renewed, and from the fear that once filled a plane's cabin, something else had taken root. Respect. From fear emerged respect, and from chaos, a blueprint for safety. The gurney rolled past the last row of the cabin, the wheels squeaking softly beneath the echo of retreating footsteps. Merrick Halden didn't resist anymore. His wrists, zip-tied and raw, rested motionless on his lap as two federal officers flanked him on either side. His eyes, no longer scanning for shadows to slip into, were vacant, drained of the eerie poise he once carried like armor. The once dignified uniform of a flight attendant now hung wrinkled and stained with the chaos of the night that exposed him. Captain Rylan Voss stood near the cockpit door, arms crossed, eyes steady on the slow procession. His jaw was tight, not from anger, but from the memory of how close it had come to tragedy. The faint overhead lights flickered above, catching the thin line of sweat still clinging to his brow. He hadn't slept. Not yet. Not until every child was counted, every parent assured, and every inch of the cabin declared safe again. Leon Vey stepped up beside him, hand resting gently on the collar of his K9, Fenrir. The dog remained poised, gaze locked on Merrick until the figure vanished down the terminal corridor the moment stretched. Raylan exhaled slowly. "You trained him well," Raylan murmured without turning. Leon gave a single nod, his voice low. "He saw what we couldn't, felt it before we even knew there was a threat." Rylan finally looked down at Fenrir. "He didn't just stop an attack. He redefined what protection means at 30,000 feet. The aftermath unfolded with quiet intensity. Investigators descended on Flight 914 before the landing gear had cooled, sweeping the cabin row by row, under seat cushions, behind meal carts, even taped beneath armrests. They found evidence of Merrick's grotesque preparation: sedatives disguised as crew supplements, cable ties hidden within his apron lining, soft fabric muzzles sewn into an extra steward satchel. Each item told a chilling story of intent, precision, and delusion. The parents, still seated with wide eyes and trembling hands, began to process the night in fragments. One father held his twin boys tightly, rocking gently, whispering prayers. Another passenger, an elderly man who had been sleeping just feet away from Merrick's final attempted assault, couldn't stop staring at the ceiling, as if the cabin might collapse at any moment. Rylan made his way down the aisle one final time, stopping at each row, checking faces. His voice remained calm but steady, his words simple. "You're safe now." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. At the foot of the terminal, media flashbulbs burst as the restrained Merrick was escorted into a transport van. Reporters shouted questions about motive, remorse, intent. Merrick said nothing. He stared ahead, empty and flickering with a strange twitch in his eye, like someone watching a film he had written. But the ending had changed without his consent. Inside the terminal conference room, Rylan debriefed with federal agents, describing in sharp, deliberate detail the movements, the anomalies. The moment he knew instinct had turned into certainty, Leon stood at the far end of the room, walking the agents through Fenrir's behavioral cues. There was no boasting, only clarity. The system had worked barely, but it had. Days later, the footage leaked. Security cams stitched together a terrifying montage. Merrick's quiet pacing, the unnatural attention he gave certain rows, the way he masked his actions in service. But it was the leap that caught public attention, the precise moment Fenrir launched from the overhead bin, silent as a shadow, intercepting a threat no one else had seen. That footage went viral. By the end of the week, Aryan Air issued a formal statement declaring Flight 914 a watershed moment in airborne safety. Merrick Halden was charged with multiple counts of attempted harm, assault on minors, and endangering the lives of passengers and crew. His background unraveled in public records, an unremarkable history, a few flagged psych evaluations that had gone unreviewed, and one letter of recommendation that had mysteriously disappeared from his file. Questions were raised, not just about him, but about the system that let him pass undetected. In parallel, the aviation world shifted. The Department of Aviation Security convened an emergency hearing. Rylan was summoned, clean-shaven and crisp in uniform, his voice steady as he outlined the play-by-play of that night. When asked if he believed the incident could have been prevented, he paused only once before answering. "Yes," he said, "but only if we stop treating safety as a checklist and start treating it like a living system, one that adapts, one that senses, and one that includes instincts, not just technology." Fenrir, seated beside Leon during the hearing, earned a commendation on national television. Children from Flight 914 sent drawings of the heroic dog, some depicting him with wings, others with a superhero cape. One sketch, mailed from a boy named Kale, simply read, "Thank you for finding me when no one else saw." Rylan's routine resumed, but never returned to normal. Every takeoff came with double checks. Every crew assignment was scanned not just for qualifications, but for behavioral patterns. Fenrir was assigned to a broader program, one that would begin rolling out K9-assisted threat detection on commercial flights nationwide. Leon became the program's lead trainer, quietly shaping a generation of guardians. Like Fenrir Merrick's sentencing months later was swift but heavy. Life without parole. His trial revealed more than intent. It showed obsession, control, and a fantasy that had consumed his reality. Yet not once did he speak of regret. Only failure. In his final statement before being escorted from the courtroom, Merrick looked up and murmured, "I didn't see the dog, not once." As if that detail, that oversight, was the only flaw in an otherwise perfect orchestration. In the gallery, Rylan sat beside Leon, watching him, not with hatred, but with calculation. The kind that knew evil didn't always come with noise. Sometimes it came dressed as help. Flight 914 became more than a flight. It became curriculum. Every airline staff training now referenced it, an entire chapter dedicated to silent threats and sensory defenders. Rylan's name became synonymous with calm intervention, Leon's with preemptive strategy, and Fenrir's with instinctual loyalty that surpassed anything mechanical. Still, Rylan didn't speak of that night often, not even to Leon. He carried it the way captains do, not as trauma, but as a weight, a reminder. Every pre-flight checklist, every scan of the cabin, every glance at a shadow that moved too long, it all came with that weight. And so, on the anniversary of the incident, Rylan stood alone beside the plane before boarding. His hand brushed the fuselage. Behind him, passengers began to arrive. Among them, children. He heard the soft patter of Fenrir's paws approaching. Leon followed, nodding silently. Rylan turned toward the gate, voice steady. "Let's keep them safe." Because now he knew. Justice soared above the clouds, carried by courage, strategy, and unwavering guardianship. He tried to finish his attack and froze as the K9 soared from the overhead bin, teeth and fury ready, turning his arrogance into instant evidence. If you believe true defense never sleeps, subscribe now. because justice doesn't pause for fear, it pounces. The story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, intimidation, and the moment accountability and courage confront cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.